Amanda, you're doing a PhD, right? Is it the University of Arizona or
Yes. Yeah.
Tucson?
Yes. Yeah, I'm here in Houston working on my dissertation, which is on non-belief and non-religious communities. So I've met a lot of you before. I've been going to meetings here in Houston.
You've been visiting with us for what, 2 or 3 months now, right?
Oh well, no, since about November, I think. So yeah, it's been a few months. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you're looking for people to interview and
Yeah, I'm still in the process of interviewing. I've interviewed a few of you here, and if anyone here would be interested in being interviewed for that project, definitely let me know.
okay.
Set something up. That's good.
How's that? What about that one over there? Should I get that too?
No, we need that.
All right. Yeah, I think this is good. All right. So humanism from a sociological perspective. So what does that mean? So I chose this topic because I'm a sociologist, and I think that sociology as a field of study is very compatible with humanism as an ideology. I think one reason for that is because sociologists are particularly interested in the plight of marginalized groups. So inequality occurring along lines of race, social class, gender, sexuality, and even religion. And I think atheists and non-believers are drawn to humanism because of its focus on the empirical world, especially people. And so are sociologists. So humanism encourages this sort of people-centered approach to life, and so does sociology. So this talk is going to be kind of like a flash intro to sociology and social inequality. So kind of like Dave's talk a couple months ago about economics, kind of an introduction to this very broad, complicated field. So there are a lot of things here in this presentation that I discuss with students, college students, freshmen to seniors, who are maybe hearing some of these ideas for the first time. And the first time I heard a lot of this stuff, I was kind of blown away because I never really thought about the world from this perspective of a sociologist. And it wasn't until years later that I decided I was a humanist, mostly because I hadn't really heard the term before. And I think sociology is largely responsible for my loss of faith in coming to recognizing myself as an atheist and a humanist. So yeah, anyway, some of these ideas that I discussed today are maybe things that you've encountered before without necessarily thinking about them as a sociologist. So more about these terms. So humanism, there are lots of definitions for humanism, and this is the definition that HOH uses. It's on the back of their business cards, on their flyers. It's defined as the life philosophy that people can live ethical, meaningful, and fulfilling lives without supernaturalism or dogma. And I think this is a good definition. It's an accurate definition of what humanism is. But I think there's a little something missing from this definition. So I Googled humanism, and one of the first things that comes up is humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. So in my own words, I would say that from a humanist perspective, energy should be directed toward advancing human well-being, not pleasing deities. And as I move through this presentation and talk about sociology and sociological concepts and research, keep this definition in mind, or this of what humanism is as we go through here. And then sociology. So this is Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim, the holy trinity of sociology. Oops. Anyway, so this is the definition of sociology, the very bare bones definition. It's the systematic and scientific study of society and group behavior.
Amanda, I recognize Karl Marx, but who are those other two guys?
Yeah, the guy on the left is going to be Max Weber. He was a sociologist, economist, historian, kind of dabbled in a little bit of everything. And on the right there's Emile Durkheim. He's considered basically the founding father of sociology. So Auguste Comte was responsible for coining the term sociology and kind of beginning that field of study. It's a relatively new field of study. But Emile Durkheim was the first appointed professor of sociology. He wrote the first empirical sociological study on suicide, actually looking at why certain groups commit suicide at higher rates than other groups. Suicide is one of those things that's considered a very individual act. But he started noticing that there were certain groups of people that tended to commit suicide at higher rates than others. So why are Catholics less likely to commit suicide than Protestants? Why are women less likely to commit suicide? Why are married people less likely to commit suicide? And he determined that it came down to social integration. That the more embedded you are in your social networks, the more ties you have, the more you have to lose, essentially, the less likely you are to commit suicide. So they kind of kicked off the discipline of sociology. And this here's a little more elaboration on how sociology and other social sciences are a little different than maybe other representations of social life that you might see in documentary films or even journalism. So there's the relevance to social theory, the incorporation of data, and systematic analysis of the data as well. And also I'll mention too, I was hoping that I'd be able to print out these slides so you could have something to look at during the presentation. I didn't get around to that, but I would be happy to email this presentation to anyone that's interested in having a copy. There's a famous essay within Sociology by C. Wright Mills. This is C. Wright Mills on his motorcycle. He's kind of a cool guy. And he wrote an essay called The Promise of Sociology. And what it does is really succinctly outline what it means to think sociologically, which entails being able to understand our own lives in the context of what's happening around us. So he calls this the sociological imagination. And the gist of it is being able to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two and society. So there's another quote, one that one of the most important lessons of sociology is that the individual can understand his own experiences and gauge his own fate only by locating himself within his period, that he can know his own chances in life, only by becoming aware of all the individuals in his circumstances. So basically, in order to understand what someone's life chances are, you need to be able to locate them in their broader social context. This reminds me of a quote from Marx. It's one of my favorite quotes that's really stuck with me over the years. That's that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. So by placing human agency inside this broader social structure, we can better see why people make the decisions that they do, and even the options that they're constrained to. And it can be really difficult to grasp this connection between our own personal biography and the time that we're living and how that may affect the structure of society and our place within it. So a major use of the sociological imagination is to be able to distinguish between personal troubles and public issues and see how those things are connected. So C. Wright Mills basically defines personal troubles as occurring within the character of the individual and within the range of his immediate actions with others. So these are the things that you are immediately responsible for, the immediate things that you are able to change in your life. Public issue, on the other hand, has to do with the organization of society as a whole. So usually public issues arise when there's some sort of social institution that we value is in crisis. Probably the biggest one being the economy. So for instance, Mills gives several examples of how something that is really a public issue might be misconstrued as someone's personal trouble. So unemployment is one of those things. So in a city of 10,000, if you have one person that's unemployed, you might call it a personal trouble. So there's something wrong with him, he's not skilled enough, he's not educated enough, he's lazy, doesn't have the opportunities. But in a nation of 50 million, if you have 15 million who are unemployed, that suggests that the very structure of opportunities has collapsed, and simply educating people and training them isn't going to fix the root problem. Another thing that's often misconstrued as a personal trouble might be marriage and divorce rates. So two people within a marriage might be experiencing personal troubles that they're directly responsible for, but when 25% of all marriages end in divorce within the first 4 years, you might begin to suspect that there's something wrong with the institution of marriage or the institution of the family, or other social institutions that exert pressure on marriage and family, such as the economy, finances. Financial issues can be a big reason why people experience issues in their marriage. A more personal example for me anyway, children of divorce face a lot of obstacles, and their outcomes are generally not all that great. So children of divorce are more likely to experience emotional problems, they're more likely to become delinquents, less likely to finish high school, finish college. They're more likely to end up divorced themselves. I'm a child of divorce. So not only that, but my mom dropped out of high school when she was 16. My dad doesn't have a high school diploma, he just got a GED. So statistically speaking, I should not have even made it to college, let alone to graduate school. So I'm kind of the statistical anomaly. So what happened here? Why didn't I suffer a lot of these issues that children of divorce typically do? So other studies find that there are factors at play that help kids adjust to divorce and even help them thrive, things like feeling loved and feeling close to both parents. So I had that growing up as a child. My parents didn't necessarily put me in the middle of their games. I always kind of felt like I was a priority to both of them, and experiencing a little conflict kind of along the same lines. My parents never really fought in front of me. They didn't say negative things about each other in front of me. Having consistent routines. I knew every weekend where I was going to go, and I knew during the week where I was going to be. And then also having a third person to rely on for support. So my mom remarried when I was pretty young, and he was always a very stable part of my life. Him and my father got along really well. So having that third party there really stabilized my childhood. So had those factors not be present, just hard work, you got where you are because you worked really hard. That might not have been enough to keep me from experiencing a lot of these negative outcomes. Because our society isn't really structured in a way that accommodates single-parent households. And I'll be talking more about that in a little while. So bottom line, of course, individuals make choices. And of course they experience personal troubles. But the choices that people make are constrained by certain factors that are outside of their control, whether that's social, historical, cultural, economic factors. Sometimes what we think are our own personal troubles really turn out to be public issues that systematically affect large groups of people across the society. Let's see. The sociologists are particularly interested in social inequality. This drives a lot of social inquiry and social research. Inequality defined basically as giving privileges and opportunities to one group of people while denying them to another. And these are often, these inequalities are often embedded in the structures of society, but they're perpetuated through culture. So inequalities are passed down from generation to generation, both tangibly, so through social class, people inherit material goods, they inherit lifestyles, and also our ideas of race and gender, those are passed down too. Let's see. I will actually skip over this. Well, basically, one of the reasons that this is important to be aware of, it's important to be aware of these inequalities, because it's easy to live your life in an exclusionary fashion if they're not your inequalities to experience. If you don't experience them personally, you can be left susceptible to racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. So it may not be intentional, but you may just not know any better. So when I started taking my first courses in sociology, it kind of blew my mind, because I realized that some of the things that I thought and views I had of the world were a little racist and a little sexist and a little homophobic. But a sociological approach to inequality allows you to step kind of outside of those boundaries of your own group and try to gain an understanding of the lives of other people who belong to different groups, which I think is a very kind of humanist approach to interacting with people. And also being aware of inequality and how it works can lead to better social policy. So I think the extent to which we have a lot of social policies out there being put on the table is because people don't really understand the dynamics of inequality and how it comes about. They don't have any sociological imagination. So there are a few dimensions of inequality, and I mentioned these a little earlier that sociologists are really interested in. One of those is race. So a lot of social scientists, and probably biologists and geneticists as well, overwhelmingly agree that race is socially constructed on a large part. So social construction is a concept that is constructed or invented through language and through social interaction. It's not a material fact, not something it has inherent truth to it. So to demonstrate this idea, when I teach this concept in my Intro to Sociology courses, I have my students think about their graduating high school class. So I'll pick a student and say, well, what year did you graduate high school? Let's say 2002. And then I'll ask them, what kinds of groups are in your graduating class? What kind of cliques made up your class? You get kind of the typical response. You get the jocks and the cheerleaders and the geeks and the, punk, emo kids, all of these different cliques that you see in high school. So, okay, pick another student. What year did you graduate high school? Say 2007. I ask them the same question, and their answers are pretty much the same. So what you end up having are these two groups that are made up of very similar subgroups, very similar cliques. So there's a lot of variation within these classes, a lot of different types of groups, different types of cliques, but there's not so much variation between them. And this is how sociologists tend to think about race, that there's huge variation in the human race when it comes to skin color, eye color, hair type, facial construction. So physical appearance is not necessarily the most logical or effective way to divide a group of people into distinct categories. But in the end, this doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if race is a real, innately real thing or not, because people do separate one another into categories, and they believe those categories are real. and different from one another, and this results in groups being treated differently. So if you look at this picture here, these are twin girls born to biracial parents. But one of them would be considered white, and the other would be considered black. And because we perceive these as two distinct categories, these children are likely to have different life experiences, even though they share the same genetic material. Okay.
Are they sisters or
They're twins.
twins?
Wow, the twins.
Fraternal twins or identical twins?
They'd be paternal twins. They're not identical.
These.
But,
Not identical exactly, yeah.
yeah. But their parents are biracial. So when you think about the types of genetic combinations you would get from parents that have both darker and lighter kind of genes for skin, there are all kinds of combinations that you could end up with. And this just so happened to be one child very dark skinned, the other very light skinned. And as a result, they'll probably have different life experiences. And I might skip over this here. These are a few studies that I wanted to talk about that deal with race. And again, I would be happy if any of you would like copies of these. I have all of these on PDF. I'd be happy to forward any of these to you. So one of the terms that makes people uncomfortable is privilege. If you talking about white privilege. So people who belong to majority groups. And when sociologists and other social scientists talk about majority versus minority groups or dominant groups versus minority groups, we're not necessarily talking about numbers. You're talking about people, the people who have power are the majority groups, and the people who are systematically oppressed are the minority groups, regardless of the number of people in them. So if you think of men and women, women are considered a minority group despite making up about half of the population. So people who belong to these majority groups, these dominant groups, don't really like to think of themselves as being privileged because it implies that things are handed to you. And people, especially I think Americans, don't really like to think that they've achieved something without really working for it, because I think that's part of our cultural script. But people who belong to these dominant groups, so if you're white, male, middle or upper class, heterosexual, or even Christian, you don't encounter things that minority groups can expect to experience. And even if, for example, you do encounter disadvantage as, say, a lower class woman, if you're white, you still benefit from certain privileges. So for example, go through these here. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. This is an example of privilege. I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can go into a music shop and count on finding the music of my race represented, into a supermarket and find the staple foods which fit with my cultural traditions, and into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair. If a traffic cop pulls me over, or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. I'm never asked to speak for all of the people of my racial group. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against my financial reliability. And finally, I can choose blemish colored bandages. I can choose blemish cover or bandages in flesh color and have them more or less match my skin.
Who made this list? It's awesome.
This is I put all these. Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. This was published in 1988. So yeah, there's a list of about, I think, originally 26, and I think she's updated the list a few times to up to, I think, 32 or 33 privileges. So these are just a few instances of those. So yeah, these might not necessarily be obvious, or in some ways these are pretty insignificant things, like, you know, flesh-colored bandages, you know, it's something that you wouldn't necessarily think about as a privilege. These are things that a white person can easily take for granted, whereas someone with a different skin color can't always count on these things, and that is what we mean by privilege. This is interesting, and another example of white privilege. I kind of made this one up myself, but even with a criminal record, I can expect better job prospects than a black applicant without one. So this is from a study. It's called Mark of a Criminal Record by Beba Pager. This was, I think, 2003. It's the year this study was released. So the graph, this is a graph from the study that measured callbacks from employers. So the sample was divided into 4 groups. White applicants without a criminal record, white applicants with a criminal record, black applicants without a record, and black applicants with a record. So some of these things might not be that surprising. So, you know, if you have a criminal record, you're less likely to get a call back than if you don't have one. If you're white, you're more likely to get a call back than if you're black. But what's interesting here is that white applicants with a criminal record were more likely to get a call back from an employer than a black applicant without a criminal record.
You know, in this day and age, those background checks aren't even done in employment settings until the job's been offered.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
Yeah.
so there, some of these things might be, there might be some check and balances.
Yeah. So
on some of these
this was from 2003. So I'm thinking at the time this audit study was done, like these were requests, like they were applications sent out and they were getting phone calls back. So I mean, even the process of applying for a job has changed in the past 10 years.
I'm not surprised at these results because it's like another example. Now this is like definitely anecdotal. This isn't like hard research experiment. But years ago on this show, this news magazine, used to come on ABC, I forget, What Would You Do? I think it used to be called. Remember that?
Yeah.
Well, one of the experiments they set up was, car dealership. They would send in, they got like two people that were in on the experiment. Mm-hmm. One was a black guy, one was a white guy. The background they gave them exactly the same, exactly identical, except one was black, one was white. So, and they set up cameras and, recorders they could hear, and they found like, in every case, they went to several dealerships just to see what experiences each one would get. And almost without, deviation, the white person, the white guy, would get better deals offered to him for cars than a black guy. Mm-hmm. Almost every time. Same background, same educational background, same credit rating and all of that, but the white person would get better deals, would get deals offered to them, and they would play hardball with the black person.
Yeah, and there was a follow-up study done to this one too, using the same data. I think the researchers went back and interviewed these employers, and they straight up say, and they're pretty genuine about it too, that no, they wouldn't discriminate. They would be willing to hire an ex-offender, and race would not play a factor in their decisions. But even though they say that, you still kind of see these, you still get these results. They may say that race doesn't matter, but they don't necessarily follow through in practice, and they're still likely to draw these conclusions about stigmatized groups, even if they're not conscious of. So, I mean, a phrase that I've heard thrown around is that, we live in a racist society without racists. So it's like racism without racists.
Have there been any studies done on, for example, let's say a white woman comes in with biracial children that are like darker skin that look more African American than white? Would that person feel, would that person face bias? Or she has children that are...
That would be interesting. I can't think of any offhand, but that might be interesting too. And how the racial dynamics of whether it's the parent or the child, you might expect to see different things. So if you have let's say a white woman who's in a interracial marriage and has biological children who appear black, people might assume that they're her adopted children. Or if you have a case where thinking if you had a darker skinned mother and lighter skinned children, you might assume like, oh, this is the nanny or some person taking care of these kids. So I mean, there are all kinds of assumptions that people make based on skin color.
A quick question, and you can deal with this later if you want, because it's not related to this. But just drilling up, social psychology, is that a subcategory in the discipline of sociology, or is it a separate discipline?
It is a subdiscipline. So you have sociological social psychology and you have psychological social psychology. And I'm not even entirely sure what the difference is. So I guess it's your priority. If you're looking more at maybe how an individual responds to its social context, that might be more psychological. But if you're looking at how the social context that someone is embedded in affects their psychology, that might be more sociological.
Yeah, I just remember in the early 70s, my undergraduate degree was in sociology, and social psychology took 2 or 3 of those classes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was under sociology, it wasn't under the psychology.
Yeah, it's its own subdiscipline. I think it, yeah, I mean, you can approach it from a psychological perspective, absolutely, but yeah, it's a subdiscipline within sociology. So moving on to social class, another dimension of inequality. So Max Weber, who was an early sociologist that I mentioned earlier, suggested that social class was made up of 3 components. Property, which would be considered material wealth, the money you make, what you own. Power, or authority, the ability to make people do what you want them to do. And prestige, or the value or respect that someone attaches to your occupation. And I actually have here you can kind of see that. So yeah, this is a little interactive thing that was in the New York Times. It must have been a few years ago, because I think I used this link in my Introduction to Sociology course, which I taught a few years ago. But this, you can kind of enter in your occupation, the money you make, and kind of find out where you fall on this, where your social class is. Social classes, it's not just how much money you make. There are other dimensions of it too. So, for instance, as a sociologist, I have a fairly high prestige. So that is the 65th percentile, higher than average. And for sociologist and post-secondary school teacher, I put both of those in. Those are about the same. I have a master's degree, so I don't have my PhD yet, but that is very, very high prestige here. That is at the 97th percentile, having a master's degree, which you have the 97th percentile. Unfortunately, I don't make any money. So this will change when I'm not a grad student anymore, and I actually have a faculty position. But I am in the bottom quintile as far as money goes. And also, I don't have a lot of savings either. I a little bit of savings, but also a little bit of debt. And as far as things I own, I don't own a home, but I do own a car. I guess that counts for something. So a little bit of wealth there. So I'm pretty solidly middle class, I guess you could say. So this kind of demonstrates that even though I do have a higher prestige occupation and a very high level of education, I don't really make any money, so I can't really live a lifestyle that reflects having a upper middle or top fifth occupation or educational attainment. And, social mobility, which is actually the same. So this is the same New York Times interactive graph. So social mobility refers to the ability to move between social classes. So you can either move up or down. So this kind of shows in 1988, if you looked at the top fifth, upper middle, lower middle, and bottom fifth, divide the population up into quintiles. See where they started in 1988 and then see where they end up 10 years later. What you'll see is there is mobility, but most people stay pretty closely to where they ended up. Most of the people at the top of the income distribution stay there or stay pretty close to there over time.
So the burning question here is, how do you define middle class? Because, in politics, no one can agree on that. And on the surveys, no one agreed. It's the perception of the people taking it.
Absolutely. I would think that with this data, it's probably measuring it by income. So looking at the top fifth, you divide people, and that's another thing too, that actually did have, I think I took that out of here. I had a bunch of graphics showing kind of how the population breaks down as far as where they fall in these quintiles. So you have the top fifth of the nation owns about like 80% of the wealth. That's the top 20% own about 80%. But this I think would be by population. So this is the top fifth of the population. So if you divide 300 million people by 5,
I once heard that you could do it by looking at what people could do. For example, if you know how to organize a charity ball, if you know how to get the politician to come and talk to your group at your house, then you're not middle class.
Oh
you're
yeah,
upper
that's a
class.
special kind of capital too.
If you know how to post bail, if you know how to find out where the squatters are living, you're not middle class. And then the
Their life
rest of the
skills
people,
are
if you know how to
yeah.
balance a checkbook, if you know how to, do the kind of things that
Yeah,
we
yeah.
have
So
to,
then you've got to figure out how do you
then you're middle
quantify
class.
that. Yeah.
I thought that was a very interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, those are things that are
approach.
really, like, how do you quantify something like even prestige is usually measured by public perception, how people perceive certain jobs on a scale of like 0 to 100, so that's how you measure prestige. But yeah, having those certain that human capital that you can use to your advantage in certain situations. Yeah, how is that factored into where you fall on the social ladder? And there's all kind. I mean, when it comes to breaking people up into social classes, like there's the Karl Marx just had like 2 classes. You either own something or you didn't own something. And then over time, that turned out to not be a very useful way to classify people, because you have people that own small businesses and are have practically nothing, and then you have other people who don't necessarily own the means of production, but they're managers who are living extremely well off. So so you have the two-class system, which I don't think is very informative, and then you also have people that just say social class needs to be broken down by occupation. You have dozens and dozens of classes that people can fall into. So yeah, people don't agree on how to measure these things.
I think another thing also that I think I found is, in addition to education, is your language skills, or the accents, or the manner in which you speak. And it's clearly, some countries like Great Britain, you can tell, just hear a person speak, and you can tell, well, that person's, the so-called upper class, and this person's not quite in the upper class.
Oh, yeah.
But here in the United States, there's still that, you still have that. Not as clearly as you have in Great Britain, but you still have that.
Yeah, no, and that kind of gets back to the idea of making assumptions about people and their skills and what they're like. For instance, I have a really good friend. Her husband is Ghanaian, and his name is Nunana, and he's trying to get a new job. He has a master's, I think, in higher education. He works as an admissions. He travels all around the world for his college, trying to recruit people for the college, and he's trying to get a new job. He has a great resume, a lot of experience. And I was talking to her, she was saying, I think, I hate to think it or say this to him, but do you think maybe instead of using your name, you could just put the initial N on your resume? Because that name is, there's a lot of ambiguity attached to that. You hear the name Nunana, and you don't even necessarily know if it's a man or woman, or what race that person falls into. There's so much ambiguity attached to that it probably limits his opportunities.
Probably a lot to that too. I believe it. Sadly true. I think.
See, this just shows mobility has decreased over time. So the percentage of families that can move has decreased slightly. Although intergenerational mobility is a real thing. So people who come from poor backgrounds over several generations can work their way up the income ladder. But that varies by context too. So here in the U.S., this it's not like a darker column is the U.S., the United Kingdom, France, Canada, and Denmark at the top. So you see Denmark having the most intergenerational mobility, in the U.S. having the least out of these countries. That means you have fewer people over generations that are moving up the social ladder in the U.S. compared to other nations. So you may have absolute mobility. You do have people over generations moving up the income ladder, but in relative terms, not as much as some of these other nations.
The one that's completely flat, which one's that?
This is generation 1, so taking a sample of families that are all starting off at the same level, near the bottom there, and then tracking the generations over time and seeing how those families and their children and their grandchildren.
And the United States is the darkest one on the far
Yes.
left.
Is all social movement monotonically upward?
If you start at the bottom.
Not all of it, but there are probably a lot of, and this is just percentages, so there are a lot of families that kind of stay there at the bottom and don't, their children, their grandchildren don't move up that social ladder. But the majority, I think, do over time, but no, not all. Mobility is really interesting. This is another study that I think is really interesting. It's kind of a classic study within sociology from 1973. And this kind of serves as an example of how social class affects the criminal justice system and how justice is administered. So in this study, the author found that class, it was social class and not necessarily crime that determined a person's reputation in their community and their fate with the police. So the study involved two different groups of teenagers. So one coming from an affluent part of towns, which he referred to as the Saints, and the other group coming from a lower income section of town, which he called the Roughnecks. So he found that the lower income group was more often clashing with the police and even ending up arrested for petty crimes, while the other group was able to avoid the local police, even though they were just as delinquent as the Roughnecks. But they were from upper middle class families, they got good grades, they were expected to go to college, and they were able to kind of escape this punishment even though they were just as delinquent as the other group of teenagers, as the Roughnecks, who were from more disadvantaged families and weren't so well-mannered, didn't dress quite as well. So the Saints, their parents kind of viewed this delinquent behavior as from kind of a boys will be boys kind of approach, whereas the Roughnecks, their parents kind of saw this behavior as being delinquent. And another big reason that the Saints were able to kind of evade trouble, stay out of jail, was because they had cars. They were able to drive to other towns and do their little petty crimes over there, whereas the Roughnecks were kind of stuck in the town where everyone knew them. So then what you end up seeing are these self-fulfilling prophecies. We have two groups of kids that engage in the same behavior, but they're treated differently. And then eventually grow up to kind of embody those stereotypes that are attached.
You know, one group that would be interesting to be studied in Texas, you probably are aware of this, and that's those convicted of sexual offenses that are supposed to be treated for their conditions, mm-hmm. and end up being placed over and over and over back into jail, mm-hmm. Because there isn't treatment available, and the whole thing's been mismanaged horribly. Mm-hmm. But you know, that would be an interesting sociological study.
Yeah, no, I mean, you see stuff like that not just with sexual offenders, but I mean people who have mental illnesses that commit crimes and aren't, you know, maybe they're placed in jail when they should be put in institutions that can actually help cure that behavior.
Of course, county jail is the biggest psychiatric treatment facility in the state.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's one thing that I was just thinking about the other day that I mentioned to my niece's fiance. He's involved in medical, you know, the mental illness care, and one of the things that occurred to me is all these problems in the Middle East with these extremist groups. And I was wondering how good of a care do they have for people suffering from psychiatric illness, and because if you have people that have certain psychiatric illnesses that become religious fanatics or whatever, if they would be treated adequately with antipsychotics, let's say, they would not be able to maybe get all these other people riled up and so forth. So my feeling is that there's probably not that many mental health facilities in Syria and Iraq and some of these places. You know, it's just how many people go without meds there. So it's interesting.
Gender, another line along which inequalities occur, and I have a lot more to say. I teach a course on gender, so I have a lot to say about this topic, but basically when we refer to sex, what we're talking about are the biological characteristics that distinguish men and women. So both reproductive organs and also secondary characteristics, things like body hair, muscles, fatty tissue, things like that. Whereas gender is cultural. So gender refers to the social behaviors or characteristics that we associate with one sex or the other. So depending on whether you're biologically male or female, there are certain behaviors that you're expected to comply with. So you're expected to dress in a certain way, style your hair in a certain way, move and behave in a certain way. So when we meet someone, we determine pretty quickly whether they're male or female. We're often relying on these gendered cues, like clothing and behavior, since we can't see primary distinguishing sex characteristics. And then sometimes we can't even really distinguish secondary sex characteristics, like body hair, facial hair, or breasts may not be visible. So when we make these snap judgments and categorize someone as male or female, we're often relying on someone's gender to come to those conclusions rather than biological sex. So even though sex and gender do oftentimes line up nicely, so people who are biologically male often conform to masculine ways of acting, and females would conform to feminine ways of acting. This isn't always the case. So this is an idea that I find really interesting, that sex is a social construction. Again, it's a concept that is constructed or invented through language and social interaction. It's not a material fact. So in this sense, it's easy to imagine how gender might be socially constructed. Culture dictates what's appropriate for men and women, and culture varies from country to country, so our ideas of what's appropriate for men and women might vary as well. But it's a little more difficult to imagine how biological sex might also be a social construction. But in some cases, our ideas about sex are socially constructed. So for instance, take those who are born intersexual or have ambiguous genitalia. So we tend to think of men and women as being kind of opposite sexes, so these puzzle pieces that fit together. But for those who are born intersexual, it's not always obvious if the infant is biologically male or female. And this doesn't really fit in with our this constructed perspective that there are only two biological sexes and two very distinguishable biological sexes. So in these cases, surgeons will often operate on infants in accordance to their expectations of what correct genitalia should look like. So I don't know how common this is in the US anymore. I think it might still be in other parts of the world, and I know that there are movements to prevent doctors from operating on infants who are intersex. But what would happen is doctors would kind of look at an infant and decide if it looked more male or female, and then they would do surgery and construct either a vagina or a penis depending on the way that it looked. Maybe what was easier to do. It didn't necessarily take into account DNA or genetic makeup, the chromosomes, if someone was XX or XY or even something else. So what you would have is children who are being raised, say, female, and then growing up and feeling uncomfortable in their own bodies because genetically they should have been male. And this picture here is just kind of a satirical little photo. They call it the foul meter. So it's used to kind of draw attention to the way that we use these surgeries to kind of solve these problems of intersex. So you measure the genitalia. If it's just under a centimeter, it's like, oh, it's a girl. It's okay. If it's more than 2.5 centimeters, it's just squeaks by. Or up to 2 inches, it's a Texan. But there's a range there where it's a little unclear if this infant is supposed to be biologically male or female, and the answer to that is surgery. So people, especially Americans, Western cultures, tend to be very uncomfortable with this idea of ambiguous genitalia. So I just think that's see, but I'll read through what it says. So gender inequality is a major talking point, especially when it comes to men's salaries versus women's salaries. So this graph shows the lifetime earnings for men and women broken down by education. And you probably can't read those two little red points there. But basically it says women who have a PhD earn about as much as a typical man with a BA. And men with some college but no degree earn about the same as a woman with a bachelor's degree. So this is kind of just documenting those gaps in pay that men and women experience at all of these different levels of education. So at the bottom you have less than high school, at the top you have doctoral and professional degrees. And at every level you see that there's a gap between men and women. So the question then is why? Why does this gap exist? Discrimination is, I think, a pretty easy answer. It's the result of cultural expectations that we have about groups, in this case women. So performance expectations of a person's competence, if they can be expected to perform a job well. Status characteristics can also play a part in here. So status characteristic is just some attribute along which people differ. So it might be gender, race, age. So women, African American, these are status characteristics. And we have different cultural beliefs about how people who exhibit those characteristics are supposed to act. Stay here. All right. This is another article that I think is really interesting. Getting a job, is there a motherhood penalty? And they find that there is. There is a wage penalty for either being a mother or being a woman of childbearing age. And this might be because what we think of as an ideal mother doesn't really line up with the cultural beliefs of what the ideal worker is like. So the ideal mother should want to spend as much time as she can with her children. She shouldn't be trying to get promoted at work. She might be less likely to take those opportunities even if they are given to her if she has children. And this is not the same with fathers either. There have been studies to see if there's a fatherhood penalty. There's actually not, and I think that's because those roles, the role of father and the role of worker, are not necessarily at odds. So fathers are supposed to be providers for their family. They might even be more likely to be promoted than a man who's not a father. There are some alternative explanations too to explain this gender gap. So there are a lot of people out there that will point to this statistic that women only make about 70% of what men do. I think it's a little higher than that. I think it's 72 or 73% of what men make. And they'll say like, well, if you account for all of these different things, then there's really not much of a gap there at all. So they point to things like life course interruptions. For example, if a woman has a child, she's typically the one who's expected to stay at home while she recovers from childbirth, maybe take a few years out of the labor market while she has a small child. And there are two big consequences when women leave the labor force and if they decide to come back later. And one of those consequences is that when you take time off, it impacts your overall lifetime earnings. So you're taking time off, not working, not making money. But another consequence is missing out on promotions. Promotions, raises, things like that. Another contributor to this wage gap is the negotiation habits of men and women. So this is a trend that begins really early on in the career. So research shows that women don't really negotiate for more money earlier in their careers like men do. So there's a popular study that shows that in an entry-level position, about 7% of women negotiated the salaries that they were offered. 57% of men negotiated their salaries. So because women tend to start out at more of a disadvantage because they might not ask for more money, it can follow them through their entire careers, especially if pay raises are determined as percentages. So say every 10 years you get a 5% raise. The person who started out a little higher is going to be much further ahead 30 or 40 years down the road. And then another big contributor to this gap is sex segregation in occupations. If you say, well, women get paid less than men, well, it's because they choose occupations that are compensated less. And I don't think you can really see this too well, but on the left here, you have in blue are men and red is women. So the top are jobs that are female dominated. These are things like nurses, secretaries, teachers, a lot of care workers in there. And then the bottom are men. So you have mechanics, truck drivers, pilots, firefighters, engineers, chief executives are predominantly male. And the male-dominated jobs also tend to be paid, compensated a little better, which is the graph on the right shows the median weekly earnings of these jobs. The top are female-dominated and the bottom are male-dominated jobs. So yeah, there's people that point to these alternative explanations and say this is what's really happening, this is what's contributing to these wage gaps. It's not discrimination, it's not just because this person's a man and this person's a woman. But this is a really interesting study, actually. This looks at the income gaps of people who go through gender transitions. So people who transition either from male to female or female to males. And I'm going to read you a quote here. This is just from the abstract. I think it's really interesting. It says, using an original survey of male to female and female to male transgender people, we document the earnings and employment experiences of transgender people before and after their gender transitions. We find that while transgender people have the same human capital after their transitions, their workplace experiences often change radically. We estimate that the average earnings for female to male transgender workers, so people who are transitioning to males, their earnings increase slightly following their transitions. While average earnings for male to female transgender workers, so people who are becoming female, their earnings fall by nearly a third. So this finding is consistent with qualitative evidence that for many male to female workers, becoming a woman often brings a loss of authority, harassment, and termination, but that for many female to male workers, becoming a man often brings an increase in respect and authority. So this is one of those studies that kind of looks at these alternative explanations and says, well, no, there is some discrimination happening here based on the cultural expectations we have of what female workers are like and what male workers are like. How much time do we have left here? How long do you guys want to go?
As long as you want.
Sexuality, another line of inequality here. So we tend to see sexuality as a black and white thing. You're either homosexual or heterosexual. Bisexual was really only made a category fairly recently. Still, even bisexuals kind of have a hard time fitting into the LGBT community, even though you have the B in there. You know, bisexuals are welcome there. They have a hard time fitting in. That's actually a topic that came up at the Black Non-Believers meeting. There was a really great panel there a couple weeks ago talking about homophobia in the Black community. And they were kind of talking about how bisexuals have kind of a hard time, fitting in there because it's sexuality, sexual orientation is kind of seen as this thing, you're either one or the other. If you're bisexual and you end up, married, if you're a woman and you end up married to a man, well, you were heterosexual the whole time, or you became straight. Anyway, but I think the Kinsey scale is a good way of illustrating this social construction of sexual orientation. So I'm sure plenty of you are familiar with this, but what the scale suggests is that there's very few people that are actually exclusively gay or lesbian or exclusively straight, and that most people kind of fall in this middle area. But because heterosexuality is the norm, it's what's expected of people, the people who are in categories 1 or 2 here on the left are going to be able to suppress any slight urges that they might have and conform to an entirely heterosexual lifestyle. But for people higher up on the scale, it might become more difficult. People might try unsuccessfully to conform to a strictly heterosexual lifestyle. And there are a couple studies here that I want to bring up. Is anyone familiar with this study by Mark, what's his name? Regnerus, I think his name is Mark Regnerus. Is Vic's familiar with that? So he conducted a study a few years ago that was a really terrible study. So it came out and his conclusions were basically that kids that come from same-sex families are a lot worse off than kids who come from married opposite-sex families. And this is also, I think, an illustration of how the peer review process can fail you. Because after this came out, it contradicted pretty much every single study that had come before it, saying that there's really no significant difference between children who are raised by same-sex parents or opposite-sex parents. So then this study came along in 2012, and a lot of these pro-family, pro-marriage, or anti-marriage equality groups really latched on to it, kind of in a similar way to, I think, how the anti-vaxxers kind of latched on to that one study that linked autism and vaccines, which was then kind of proved to be a problematic study, but people still to this day kind of latch onto that and use that as evidence. So I think in the same way, yeah, it was debunked. And I think in the same way you're going to see groups for years to come using this study as an illustration that children of same-sex couples turn out really poorly. And there are all kinds of issues with the way that he constructed his samples and how he defined same-sex relationships. So he was including in this sample of same-sex couples kids who were raised in opposite-sex families who then maybe split up, when the kids were adults and moved out of the house, and then their parents split up and one of them married, the mother married another woman, and they define that as a same-sex relationship or someone coming from a same-sex family.
After they had already left the home?
Yeah, they were included in that. And then there were all kinds of problems with the funding sort that this project was funded by, conservative, pro-family.
So did the peers endorse this study? Did the peer, if this was a peer review, was it endorsed?
It was passed, and then when people started questioning, they went back and they looked at it. The editors released like this incredibly apologetic, this should have never made it through the peer review.
Weren't there actually
he's
zero?
At Austin, actually, I think he's at UT Austin.
Weren't there actually 0 instances of a committed same-sex couple raising a child?
I think so. I think if you looked at the data and
There actually was
the
not
way
even a
that you
single
would
one.
typically define a two same-sex parents raising a child through, childhood, through infancy and adolescence, like either 0 or like 1 or 2 or something like that. They're yeah.
So science is okay if it proves their point.
Yes,
If
that's
it doesn't
kind
prove
of.
their point, it's.
So yeah, this is one of those studies that I think will be cited for years to come.
Well, and you
among-
mentioned that
Yeah, being
the
persecuted.
you mentioned that the studies have shown that there's no
Yeah, this
difference.
is good.
So yeah,
But in
this-
some ways, haven't some studies actually shown, in some measures, children of same-sex parents, by some measures, do better
yeah,
at
yeah,
certain
I think
characteristics?
so, yeah. This actually, I was just going to talk about this study here. How does the sexual orientation of parents matter? Implying that it does matter on some dimension. And what they ultimately ended up finding is that the only way that children of same-sex couples maybe experience negative consequences that their peers from opposite-sex parents didn't experience was that they would get harassed by other children in school who would bully them or tease them for having, 2 moms or 2 dads instead of a mom and a dad. So any negative experiences that these children experience are largely coming from people who are prejudiced against those
Yep.
types of families. I'll mention religion here. So
Yeah, do you have any data on non-religious groups or non-religious parents?
I do a
or-
little bit. I'm going to talk about one study here in a second, and actually I might actually just skip over this. This is something I discuss with my students on day one. I teach a course on sociology of religion, and I tell them we are not interested. Sociology is not interested in determining which religion is true and which religion is right. You know, that's for theology and philosophy. We're not going there. But we're interested in things like social practices and rituals, the social structure of religion, and how religion interacts with the family or politics or education. Things like that are what sociologists are interested in. And I have a couple of studies here that I want to look at. Christian privilege, which is kind of a spin on the white privilege that I talked about a little earlier. And then also, do you believe in atheists? This was the study that a lot of people are familiar with. This is the one that people compared atheists to rapists and said that people trust atheists about as much as they trust a rapist. So I'm going to talk about that study a little bit. I don't think people really, it's not like they went up to people and said, hey, who would you trust more, an atheist or a rapist? It's kind of interesting how they came to those conclusions. But anyway, yeah, the Christian privilege. This says Club USA. This says snap, I forgot to put your names on the list. So kind of poking fun of this idea that the US is a predominantly Christian. Christians have a lot more privileges than some other religious groups do. So these are really similar to some of the white privilege things that I read earlier. So for example, I can assume that I will not have to go to work or school on significant religious holidays. I can be financially successful and not have people attribute that to the greed of my religious group. I can travel and be sure to find a comparable place of worship when away from my home community. I can be sure that my holy day, Sunday, is taken into account when states pass laws and when retail stores decide their hours. I can be sure when I hear someone in the media talking about God, they're talking about my God, the Christian God. I can have a Jesus is Lord bumper sticker or a Christian fish on my car and not have to worry about someone vandalizing.
Is there some significance to the hyphen?
It's how Jewish
I'm
people
thinking maybe the
often-
author was Jewish.
Yeah,
That's
that's
what I
yeah,
think.
you write it G. You can't write the name. It's too holy. It's
I
an
copied it,
orthodox
yeah,
position.
I copied and pasted this from the article, so I'm assuming maybe it was written by a Jewish author. All right, here's the anti-atheist prejudice article. So, people don't like atheists. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with those studies. You give people a long list of minority groups and ask, who do you vote for, who do you trust, who do you dislike. Atheists are kind of, right at the bottom there. The question then is why, and there are researchers out there that are trying to figure out what is it about atheists that people really don't like, what's driving these negative perspectives. So this chart probably you can't really see it very well, it probably wouldn't even make a lot of sense if you could. So explain the study a little bit. So participants in the study were given surveys that contained a vignette, a little short hypothetical story, and it would describe some sort of crime or questionable activity. So for instance, leaving fake insurance information after you hit someone's parked car because someone's watching you. So the participants then were asked after reading this vignette, is it more likely that the person described here was A, a teacher, or B, a teacher and a Christian, or B, a teacher and a Muslim, teacher and a rapist, or a teacher and an atheist. So the last one was varied there. So one participant would have to choose between A, a teacher, and B, a teacher and a Christian. The next participant would have to choose between A, a teacher, B, a teacher and a Muslim, etc. And this is called a conjunction fallacy. So you're always supposed to choose the option with fewer descriptors. So it's mathematically more likely that the person described in the vignette is just a teacher rather than a teacher and something else. So when you add more descriptors, it becomes less and less likely that the person being described will, fulfill all of them, regardless of what the descriptors are. But people will overwhelmingly fall victim to this fallacy when the descriptor being added seems characteristic of the person being described. So in the study, the correct answer is always A. It's statistically more likely that this person will just be a teacher rather than a teacher in something else. But people would fall victim when either option B was teacher and rapist or teacher and atheist. And what this means is that people are more likely to associate this immoral behavior described in the vignette with either rapists or atheists.
What year was this? What year was this done?
2011.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just a
not
few years ago.
1950, that was shocking.
2011. So yeah, what's even more interesting is that there was no statistically significant difference between whether people, the people who would choose rapist and the people who would choose atheist. So what this photo here shows is on the far left, those are people who picked Christian, teacher and Christian, teacher and Muslim, and then the higher bars are teacher and rapist, and actually the teacher and atheist is even a little higher than that. So how the researchers interpreted this then is that atheists are viewed as an unethical group of people, and participants were unlikely to select, B when it was accompanied with Christian or even Muslim. They were less likely to choose to do the conjunction fallacy. But when rapist was thrown in, people already know that, that's, pretty immoral, terrible behavior, and if someone's willing to rape someone, they might be willing to, lie, to or leave a false note on someone's car. But what about atheists? What do atheists do? So the only thing that a lot of people know about atheists is just that they don't believe in God, they don't believe in religion, and religion is where you get your morals and ethics from, right? So because a majority of people don't really know what atheists believe, what they don't believe, and what they're capable of, they will automatically associate atheism with immoral behavior. Since they're kind of perceived as rejecting this institution that a lot of people believe this is where our morals and values come from. So atheists are kind of this, ethical wild card. And finally, I want to just mention, kind of end here mentioning intersectionality. This was something too that was mentioned in the Black non-believers panel on homophobia and how important it is to take into account how these different inequalities intersect. Intersectionality helps us understand how things like race, class, gender, sexuality might manifest differently. So an example I have here is at the last Humanists of Houston citywide meeting when Don Wright stood up to talk about, I think, the Day of Solidarity that the Houston Black non-believers were holding. I was sitting next to a guy that I knew and had talked to before, and he kind of leaned over and said, like, I don't agree with that. I don't think there should be a Houston Black non-believers group because they're supposed to be humanists. They should be including everyone. It shouldn't just be Black people. But what intersectionality suggests, if you're approaching it from this framework, is that the experiences of non-believers in general are not necessarily going to be the same as the experiences of Black non-believers specifically. This is a term that was mentioned at the Empower Hour too, that being Black and being LGBT are kind of these intersecting inequalities, and that issues that are faced by Black LGBT individuals might be different from those that are faced by the LGBT community as a whole. And I came across this cartoon the other day that I think sums it up really, really well. So a fun guide to intersectionality. So this is Bob. Bob is a stripy blue triangle and should be proud. Yay me, he says. Sadly, some people do not like Bob. Bob faces oppression for being a triangle and for having stripes. So down here it says, down with stripes, God hates triangles. But luckily there are liberation groups, but they aren't intersectional, so they look like this. So you have one group that says, triangles welcomes, the group for triangles, and the other one says welcome stripes. But they don't talk to each other, in fact they compete. So the triangle says, I'm more oppressed, and the striped circle says, no, I deserve more. So Bob can't work out where to go. So he says, am I more stripe or more triangle? So Bob wishes that the triangles and stripes could work together. So oppression affects all of us, no liberation without equal representation. So it says here, intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. So oppressions are not isolated. So one of the things that the transgender woman on the panel talked about, she's first black and then transgender. And that's something that when she is involved in the LGBT community, people don't really understand that and the LGBT thing is kind of their issue. They don't really understand why she needs to keep talking about how she's black. So this is just an example of how these groups should be working together rather than opposed. So finally, real quick, how can sociology inform humanism? And I hope that this idea of humanism, that humans should be the center of how our energy should be expended, is kind of apparent through these studies. Sociology is really about helping people by understanding them. So I think being aware of this sociological perspective can help foster awareness and also help us understand how we can act. So it raises consciousness, it teaches us how to think or what to think about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it also hopefully helps us determine how we can act to solve these problems. So understanding the problem helps us to be able to understand a solution. So for example, if you want to reduce poverty, this is a really big issue. How do you reduce poverty? It's not just throwing money at poor people. You need to understand the predictors of poverty. Why are people poor? It has to do with geography, race, education, gender. So rather than just throwing money at poor families, invest in the infrastructure. People need to be able to get to work. If they don't have a car and the city that they live in doesn't have a good system of infrastructure, they're not going to be able to get to work. Education, invest in, especially early childhood education. Children are the biggest group affected by poverty. And a lot of that is because most poor households are headed by women. This is something that's known as the feminization of poverty. Women are more likely to experience poverty than men. They make less money, as we just learned a little earlier. They, especially single mothers, they may have to decide whether to work and pay for daycare or not work and accept government money because they don't have anyone else to watch their kids. So, invest money in making childcare affordable so women can work. So if you understand the causes of something, you are able to construct better social policy to address those issues. And finally, these are just a couple of resources. A lot of the graphs that I use come from Sociological Images. It's one of my favorite websites. Like it says, they post images of graphs and videos, and it's run by a sociologist out of a college in California. A lot of really interesting information on there. Contexts is it's more of a journal than a magazine. It's kind of similar to Psychology Today. Psychology Today is run by the American Psychological Association, and you can get it in Barnes & Noble. It comes out, once every 2 months or so. Context, I think it's the sociological equivalent of that, only it's not as accessible. So you can't buy it in bookstores, but a lot of this content is available online. So you can get pretty accessible sociological information from there. And then also something that I was reminded of, actually, I've had this book in my car since I got it. It's been there about 5 years. This is a little tiny book. It's called This Is Water by David Foster Wallace. Has anyone read this book? Anyone aware of it? So David Foster Wallace he was an author. He actually committed suicide just a few years ago. He gave a commencement speech at, I think, Kenyon College, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 11 years ago or something, and it was published in this little book. It's a tiny little book. It's got one sentence per page on it. It's like about a 20-minute speech. And it was called This Is Water, referring to fish being in the water and not really realizing that they're in the water. Some thoughts delivered on a significant occasion about living a compassionate life. I think this is one of the best non-sociological things that I've ever read, and it's a commencement speech, so it's aimed at college students about how to go through life and how to think, talking about how a liberal arts education, because this was a liberal arts college, how that education really teaches you to think about the world. An example he gave, which was actually an example that was given in the spiritual naturalist meeting that I went to a few days ago. Something a way to improve your life or experience spirituality is, when you're in the car and you're experiencing road rage, think of the people in these other cars around you as your loved ones, and that can really kind of calm you and help you better, just be a better person and be happier in life if you have empathy. And I think that's really what this book was about, is about living kind of an empathetic lifestyle and understanding the plights of other people and giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I think it's very sociological. It's very compatible with a humanistic lifestyle. So I would think of all the things that I've talked about, these would be some of the resources that I would recommend to go to for more information. And that is my presentation.
Thank you very much.
Back to the very beginning, I was hoping you would cover more of a difference between sociology and anthropology, but as you went through, I came up with sort of an interesting question that might shed light on that, which is whether anthropologists have ever discovered that a society has ever existed without some way or another some kind of oppressed minority, because in my brief lifespan I found out that especially shocked a few years ago to find out that in Japan, I believe, that there are people that to us would look absolutely indistinguishable from each other, but somehow they're almost lower than what we used to think of as the untouchable class in India or whatever, that, even though there are no specific racial or religious things, that there were, ideas of how they did the language and so on, but just basically, is this somehow, as a sociologist, is it necessary? One of the things they taught me somewhere was that we had to have religion, that individuals could not have religion, but we couldn't have a society without religion. Well, can we have a society without people on a lower class that are discriminated against?
I don't know how to answer that.
I got some input on that. I just read this book, really just probably a month ago. Really great book. It's called Sex and God, by this author. Daryl Ray, you at that Oasis thing where he spoke. Well, I read, that book. He's got like another book out, but I read this one. And one of the things that's interesting, going to like your point about has there ever been, do we know of a society where there wasn't like an oppressed group of people or exploited group of people? One of the examples that he uses in the book of such a society is, I forget the name of the tribe, but it's this obscure tribe in Africa. Actually, he uses like examples of 3 cultures where there was like no differentiation notable between people, between men and women. In fact, in this one African culture, women actually were like on top. It was like a matriarchal society. They could have like multiple sex partners. There was no shame, or there was no looking down on it. I mean, it was the thing that the three examples he uses, the one thing that they all have in common, they all have hunter-gatherer like
Yeah, I
roots.
was gonna say, if you,
Yeah.
if you wanna look for the most egalitarian societies, you're
Yeah.
gonna have to go all the way back to
Yeah,
hunter-gatherer.
pre-agriculture, development of agriculture, because once agriculture was developed, that's where the idea of property came into play, and then men begin to see women as an extension of the land that they own and the crops that they grew, and then organized religion started to develop. And these three examples he uses in his book, another similarity is they don't really have organized religion. They don't. There's no. I mean, they have a sense of gods, like to explain, different things, but it's not really very organized, and it's not very restricted on them. It's just amazing. It's just the development of agriculture brought along a lot of negative things for the human race, basically, especially in terms of the oppression of women.
The idea of eliminating inequality in the type of society we live in today seems not possible, but, yeah,
Well,
you have to go pretty far back in
It's
time.
a
Bring up that
direction
one.
process. It's not
Something
gonna
that's
happen.
been eating at me lately is the idea of, say, the concept of a career woman or a career girl, okay? So we have that. I think we all have some concept, maybe differ to some extent, but that has some meaning to us. Now say career man, career boy, doesn't even make any sense, okay? Why is that? Okay, it's because if you're a male like me and you don't work, you better be royalty, because otherwise you're a bum. And so there really is no element of choice here, and so just that concept alone, I think the fact that we still distinguish that there is still such a thing as a career girl, but there is no such thing as a career boy, then how can the work possibly be equal? And the expectations that you talk about, you keep talking about society's expectations, but how about that individual person's expectations? You know, if
Yeah,
the
let's
man
become
doesn't make
internal.
enough money, I mean, that's going to be pressed on him. And I'm sure there are many in here who felt that, you know. So, and a woman has more of an ability to make a choice, and a lot of men would choose to make less money if they could have a nicer job. And so it's offensive to us then when they say that, you know, just because men get paid more. I mean, it used to be equal pay for equal work, you know, so we judged, okay, and I would be out there picketing for somebody if I found out that some guy in your department was the same level, doing the same thing as you are, and you're getting paid less just because he's a guy. But I don't see that, you know, certainly not very often. You probably get paid less than somebody selling Mercedes, you know, but, you know, you'd rather be doing what you're doing. I'd rather be teaching piano lessons. I don't bother that I'm making half as much or, you know, a quarter as much as a lawyer. I'm doing what I want to do.
Yeah, but I think when you look at it as a whole, women are at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's even close. I mean, maybe in this one specific example you just gave, okay, yeah, a woman might have a slight advantage because there's a name for what she does, but there's another example of something where women are named, there's a name for it, but there's not a name for men. This is just one. The term cougar came into, you know, popularity several years ago, and we all know what a cougar is. A cougar is an old woman that likes younger men. Big deal. But there's no name for a man that does that. Men have been doing that since time immemorial. Men just do it. There's no name. That's what a man does if he wants to do it.
Called dirty old man.
Dirty old man.
Well,
Usually when he's really
I mean,
old, he's
And
gotta
he's
be
gotta
But
be
it's gotta
like
be real old.
yeah,
Just-
and like
I mean,
behaving
she's gotta be
The
inappropriately.
point
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
and even that term is like, it's kind of like humorous, but it's
Yeah.
like,
You're right.
cougar. It's like why does that even need to be the name cougar? Why isn't it just a woman that likes younger men? I mean, it's just, you know, that's just one example, and that's you could just go on and on with that. So I think when you look at it as a whole, I mean, there's definitely male privilege. As a male, I know I have male privilege over women. Certain privileges that I enjoy, whether I like it or not. That's just reality that a woman does not have.
Well, there's also like when you mentioned being compensated differently for doing different jobs. You know, a lot of the jobs, these jobs that are you know, female dominated tend to be compensated less, and a lot of these jobs that are male dominated tend to be compensated more. And then you start asking, like, why are these jobs compensated differently? But also, you know, why are women choosing, you know, these jobs that are mostly, you know, caring, like care occupations? So, like, why are women kind of being funneled into those jobs? Why are men more likely to go into, you know, STEM research, going into science or engineering? What is it, you know, where does that start? It starts at a really young age, kind of men being, or young, you know, boys being encouraged to do certain types of activities, and women being encouraged to go into other types of activities. And then you kind of see, you know, that split pretty early on. So yeah, there is, I mean, you can see it in the data, there's, you know, sex segregation in the workplace. So yeah, it's clear, you know, women are going into different jobs than men, but why is that? Why are they compensated differently? Because,
He said his hand up for a while.
oh, no?
There's two observations that I want to make, and I'm wondering if just the fact that you know that you're different or you're in a minority have an effect. And the reason, the observation that I'm making is, I was part of like the first group of Hispanics that really went to college, and I went to a small college in South Texas, where the whites were only like about 15 to 20% of the student population. And I noticed as soon as I got into college, it seemed to me that the white grades, the grade levels of the whites were suddenly being affected by that. And, you know, and I think what it was is, you know, the Hispanics were the ones that were being elected to class president and then, you know, stuff like that. All of a sudden it seemed that for the majority of the whites, their grades went down except for the exceptional students. And that's the same pattern that you see, you know, for minorities in the regular school. The majority of the student grades for the students are low except for the exceptional students. And it seemed to be like that had completely reversed. And the other observation that I've noticed in my lifetime is that as soon as an occupation starts becoming occupied by females and minorities, both the status and the pay level of that occupation seems to go down. I don't know if that's because the market is being flooded, or is it some kind of racial or sexual, you know,
I would be
prejudice.
surprised if it's both.
And
I
the
think those
opposite too.
Veterinarians are
Yeah.
a great
those
example of
effects,
that.
but, yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking that once the men moved into nursing,
Yeah.
Yep.
the status went up and the pay went up.
And as women moved into veterinary medicine, in spite of the fact that you spend as much as you do on getting a regular human medical degree, pay for veterinarians has dropped dramatically over the last 15 years. I went to a school that had a veterinary school, and all of my vet friends were women, and graduating with $200,000 in student loan debt and finding $40,000 a year, $50,000 a year jobs, unless they're willing to go do large animal practice, which they were told they were too little or not strong enough to do. So, my father-in-law was a veterinarian, and he says, oh, we used to make good money until all those women started coming in. But
So it's the women's fault.
well,
Yeah.
that's what your dad thought, but yeah.
Vic, you ready?
Yeah, so you mentioned the experiment towards the end there that showed how distrusted atheists are, and why, you know, some of the perceptions and stereotypes. Can you, I know this could be a whole presentation by itself, but can you kind of just touch on some of the, what the data really says on that issue?
About why, like,
As far as, well, are there preconceptions or the prejudices, is there any truth to it? Are they justified? What is the reality of
Just the
what the
ones
data
that are also
shows?
triangles with blue stripes.
the atheists who are also rapists are probably the most distressed. But no, I mean, so there's another study, which is a really famous study within sociology, called Atheists as Other. It was published back in 2006. And that was the study that really showed that atheists are, people don't want to vote for an atheist. They don't want their children marrying atheists. They're the most disliked, distrusted minority group, and they're also gaining acceptance at slower rates than other marginalized groups. So if you look at the rate at which people have accepted homosexuality and same-sex marriage, those numbers go up way faster than those numbers for atheists. And so they complemented this quantitative data with interviews with people asking about why they distrust these groups, what they think of these certain groups. And what's interesting is that those people who put atheist at the bottom of those lists also reported not actually knowing any atheists. I mean, they probably do, they just don't know it. But they said, no, I've never met an atheist.
This is the biggest don't ask, don't tell left in society, I think.
So these are people that I'm surely they've met atheists. They probably know people very well who are atheists, but they don't know that those people they know are atheists. So they have all of these perceptions which are based on, this common conception that you get your morals and ethics from religion. That's where it comes from. And if you don't have religion in your life, how can you be a moral person? So a lot of those negative perceptions stem from that. It also stems from, there's this very prominent association between being American with being religious, specifically being a Christian. So if you're not Christian, if you reject Christianity, are you rejecting America too? Are you not patriotic? So there's that kind of misconception too, that there's this connection with people who reject God and reject religion are not really, good Americans or good citizens.
Is that notion that prickly essentially started in the 1950s, or does that really predate that?
I'm not really sure when they started tracking that data. I know I could probably bring up the article here.
I wasn't concerned about tracking data, but it's, best available knowledge of the
as far
significance
as
of religion in social settings. Does it really change in 1950 or not?
I'm sure it did, with especially the communism in China and the Red Scare and really seeing communism as a threat and communism being associated with atheism, and then you really see this push where this desire to differentiate ourselves from those communist nations, which are also support atheistic principles. So you get saying no, we're different from them, we're Americans, we're Christian, and you see I think maybe that is where that idea really kind of takes off, that association with being American, with being Christian.
And maybe right now the Republican promote the issue of their religion and more of a Republican now becoming, looks like.
Yeah, and if you look at the data too, as far as rates of religious disaffiliation, you have more and more people that are maybe not necessarily losing their belief in religion, but they don't consider themselves as belonging to any particular religion. So you have over 20% of the population now, if you give them a survey, they'll check the none box, no affiliation. And that, I think, is driven in large part by the religious right and Republicans kind of